Welcome everyone to the Picker Center's Food for Thought lecture series. Today we're honored to have founder of the Food for Thought lecture series with us to give a wonderful presentation. And that's going to be Director William Emick, and he's going to be discussing cross-sector partnerships, how they could help convert COVID-emptied urban commercial buildings into affordable housing. And really happy to have you, Bill, for the second time. He inaugurated the Food for Thought series last summer, and he's back again. So thank you, Bill, for being with us, and I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you everyone for coming. I have to admit that I never imagined that last spring when we came up with this idea to try to fill the void of conversations between us in person by doing it virtually. I never imagined we'd be here a year later still doing this, which is great. And I hope we continue to do it from now on, and maybe even by the fall, we could have it live and have the majority people in person and then have other people. I mean, one of the things I have learned through this and through, I've been doing what they call high flex teaching since the spring, where, you know, you have some of you, I think, have been part of it, where you have some people in the classroom and most of the people like this. Again, I'm hoping that come the fall, we'll just flip the classroom and we'll have most of the people in the room, and then people who can't come either because of schedule or work, or they feel not so good, or they're in Mongolia, that we talk a lot about inequality and inclusion and diversity, and certainly one of the ways, by the way, if you have your mic on, you probably should mute it, please. But one of the ways that we could make our student body even more diverse than it is, it's very diverse, but even more diverse, would be using this mixed model. So I'm hoping that we don't lose the good parts of this when we have the great opportunity to be together. So thank you for coming. I hope not to talk for too long. I hope you had a chance to look at the brief paper, but I'd like to share with you a little bit of my personal experience with affordable housing, first as a child, and then later as a housing professional, and then a little bit through social value investing and cross-sector partnerships, all of which combined to lead to this paper, which, just like Zoom, I think COVID-19 may open a door to a huge positive movement of creating more affordable housing in our cities, not only around the country, but around the world. So flashback to me being born in Brooklyn, when Brooklyn was where poor people and working class people lived, not Brooklyn where it's more expensive than Manhattan. So there's an old TV show, if you've ever seen it, it's called The Honeymooners with Jackie Gleason. It's a classic TV show. And it was set in Brooklyn, and he was a bus driver. And so that was the typical Brooklyn resident, you know, a truck driver, a sanitation, his best friend was a sanitation worker. They were the people who built the tunnels. They were people like my father who worked in a factory. So it was working class at best, and a lot of poor people as well. And so housing was relatively affordable. It was not high quality, but we lived in a 4-story walk up. So, you know, 4 flights of stairs anytime you wanted to go out. And they were, you know, they were tenements. So they were designed like railroad flats, and, you know, they had intermittent heating, and some of them had the bathroom in the kitchen, and they had limitations, but it was relatively affordable for most people. And New York City post Second World War had a program called rent control, which limited, the government limited how much rent could be increased every year. And there were caps on rent for units. So that's the world I grew up in. And fortunately for me, my parents, while poor, were hardworking and smart, and they got married, and then they waited 7 years to have a kid. And they both worked crazy hours, and they saved up enough money to make a down payment on a house in Queens. And they got government financing, which was at 1%. And so even though my father worked at minimum wage plus overtime, we were able to live in our own house. And then once they lived in their own house, well, then property appreciates. So then we moved to when I had, first it was just me, then it was me and my brother, and then they had twins. And so there were 4 of us. So then we moved to New Hyde Park, and that was right on the Queens border, a little bit bigger house. And then that went up, and, you know, we were getting bigger and wanted place to play ball. And so then they moved out to Suffolk County. And at that time, it was a brand new development. And I could remember riding in the car with my father, the 6 of us all in this little car. And I was, even though I was 10 or 11, I was mortally afraid. I was convinced we were going to drive right into the ocean. It just seemed so far away. And in many respects, in the 1960s, it was really far away. There wasn't even a high school where we lived. There was an elementary school, but I had to be bused to another community to go to high school. So that was our story. So affordable housing was not a crisis in New York. Quality of housing was not great, and government extremely intervened in the market. And politics changed, and rent control was capped. And so the new units that were built were not rent controlled, and more units got to be built, but rents also went up, and more people continued to move to New York. And by the time I was out of college and working, affordable housing was a crisis in New York City. And on top of it, the kind of housing that I lived in, because it was rent controlled and landlords had very little margin to make money, didn't keep their properties up. And then on top of it, there was a fiscal crisis in New York City. So literally, tens of thousands of units of housing were abandoned by the landlords. They just stopped paying their taxes. People stayed there, people paid their rent, but the properties defaulted on their obligations to the banks and their obligations to the city. And as luck would have it, here I was working in New York City in the budget division. I was a financial analyst, and Ed Koch was the mayor. And there was a big meeting, and he said, this can't continue. We have all these people living in housing that's not being taken care of, didn't have heat in many places. And the city's collection of rents, of property taxes on these rental properties kept diminishing. So literally, typical non-payment of property taxes in a big city is about less than 1%. In New York City, it had risen to 10%. So the mayor said, this can't continue. We got to do something. So we asked the lawyers, what can we do? He said, you cannot by law move against the owner. You can only move against the property. So if you want to do something, you got to take the properties. And a number of people in the room said, we can't do that, because then we'll be the owners and we'll be the slum landlord and we don't have any money. And now what is a public problem will be your problem, Mayor. You'll be the slum landlord. And to his credit, Mayor Koch was never afraid of anything. He said, well, we're all going to be bankrupt if people stop paying their taxes, because once it gets around that these guys aren't paying their taxes, then other people stop paying their taxes, and then we won't have any money at all. So we got to take this property. So then someone in the room said, so yeah, but who are we going to get to take this job to manage all these terrible properties with literally, I think at that point, there were about 150,000 families living in these buildings, most of the buildings being vacant. And everyone in the room said, nobody will take that job. And so I said, Mayor, this is going to be a problem. If we're going to take this property, we got to manage it. And if we don't have anybody to manage it, we can't do it. And he said, I know somebody who could do a great job. I said, who? He said, you. So I was 29 years old. I didn't really know anything about housing other than I had lived in housing. I knew a lot about finance, which was good. And so I became overnight the largest slum landlord in the world at the time. And I had all these properties and all these people and all these buildings on days like this with no heat. And they were dangerous. And so long way of getting to, that's how I became intimately aware of affordable housing and all the challenges. There's a very happy ending to the story, and that is the collective efforts of a lot of people. We figured out ways to save all of this housing. We organized, some tenants were organized and we supported them. Some communities were organized and we supported community-based organizations. And there were responsible private owners under the right terms who were willing to take the properties. So flash forward to today, of those 150,000 occupied units, 93% of them are still occupied and they're viable. And many of them are owned by the people who live there. And then many others are owned by community-based organizations and some are private. There's a whole block, just I'm at SEPA, back down to 108, 109th Street on Amsterdam. Those were all part of my portfolio, shall we say, way back when. And they're all now owner-occupied apartments and doing very well. Here we are 30 years later. So we did it through organizing. We did it through tenant and community-based organizations. But what we haven't talked about yet, and what is the biggest problem here, is money. Where do you get the money to fix these units up, to preserve them, to build them, to keep them in place? And how do you create either rent levels or ownership levels that people who are not rich can afford? And that's really difficult. Our timing was right. There was a new development, which was also supported by the state, called Battery Park, which is that whole beautiful development down by the World Trade Center. That was all vacant at the time. It all became occupied. And part of the deal in developing it with private developers is part of their, in lieu of tax payments, was created as a Housing New York fund. And that fund is still alive today, supporting affordable housing. So we created basically a cross subsidy where market rate commercial development paid money into a fund that the government, the state, and the city then used to create affordable units around the city. And ultimately, it's produced about 200, either produced or preserved 230,000 units of affordable housing. But for those of you who live in New York, you know it's still not nearly enough. When de Blasio came in, he said he was committed to support another 500,000 units, which was still not enough, and the reality is they've only done about 136,000 units. So there's a big gap. And the gap is not just in New York. It's in New York. It's in San Francisco. It's in Miami. It's in London. It's in Hong Kong. Almost any Bogota, you name a big city, and there's affordable housing crisis. And the question is, what do you do about it? So one method is the one that I just talked about. Another method is the one that I mentioned earlier. Government can intervene and cap rents. And during COVID, we've had something like that. The federal government, the state government, local governments have put a moratorium on evictions. They've basically said to landlords, you can't throw people out if they don't pay rent. In the new subsidy bill, there's probably going to be money to help tenants pay back their rents and to subsidize landlords for the rents that they pay. But just like rent control in the old days, it's something that can't continue. Why can't it continue? Because ultimately the economics don't work. The dollars and cents of operating an apartment unit in a big city like New York or San Francisco or Miami, the amount that people can afford to pay, particularly people below the median, is too much. They can't afford to pay it. So even if they pay their rent every month, that rent level that they can afford can't support the building. So the landlord can't support the building. So there are programs that exist called Section 8, a federal program that subsidizes rents. And that does something. We have what I think you've all heard about, public housing, where government actually builds and owns housing. And there's a lot of housing, public housing in New York. But again, if you've, or any city in the US that you've lived in, public housing's reputation is not the greatest. It's good, it's better than nothing, but the quality, and particularly over time, the quality of the housing deteriorates and it's never what it should be. And then more recently, and what Mayor de Blasio has been trying to do, is with new units of housing, saying to developers, if you want to build a new building on this site, which is owned by the city, 20% of the units have to be affordable to low and moderate income people, and you have to keep them that way. And how do you do that? You got to raise the charges for the 80%, so they provide enough money to pay for those units and a profit for you. And actually that model is a pretty good model, but the amount of units it can produce is limited, right? Because for every 100 units you build, you only get 20 affordable units. So you got to build a lot. And new construction takes years. From the time that you authorize a new construction in a city, anywhere from 3 to 5 years, depending upon how. So it can help over time. We could, and Mayor de Blasio has talked about this, he hasn't done much, but we could use some of the land on public housing units to build more affordable housing. We could consider, which I think we should, selling public housing to the tenants who live there and ultimately allowing those units to become market rate, and then using the profit that they pay to buy the unit to build new units of affordable housing. There are lots of ideas, but the pandemic has created an opportunity in housing, a huge opportunity. And in a fairly short presentation in the paper, which I'll summarize here, here's the idea. Right now in New York, only 8% of the office space in Midtown, in Manhattan, is occupied. Since last March, 8%. Almost all of it is leased. but only 8% of the people who work for those companies that lease the space are coming in because of COVID. But because of Zoom, and because of the reality that many office workers work on the computer and on their phone, and they don't really need to come from Long Island or Westchester or New Jersey to sit in an office to use a computer, that they could do exactly the same thing at home, which that's what's been happening for the last year. They could be just as productive potentially from home. And office space is really expensive, and transportation is expensive, and CO2 and pollution. So now a lot of people are saying, and I'll give you a specific example, the largest single employer of people in office space in San Francisco is a company that I'm sure you've heard of, which is called Salesforce, which is a big HR support, computer support for companies all over the world, but particularly in the US. They're the largest single employer of downtown employees in San Francisco, 54,000 employees. They announced last week that all of their employees will have an opportunity to work from home 2 days a week. And some of those employees will work from home 5 days a week, which, as the largest renter of office space in San Francisco, you could think about what the implications of that are. Not just for the landlords, but for the delis and restaurants and parking garages and dry cleaners and all the small businesses that in one way, shape, or form are supported by office workers. And in fact, the biggest single source of employees in big cities are what we would call office workers. So what's going to happen? Well, you could imagine disaster. Lots of landlords going bankrupt because their tenants don't pay the leases, lots of small businesses that have closed temporarily, staying closed permanently. You can imagine neighborhoods that are totally isolated, no one there. It's not a pretty picture. Unless you think about, problem here, affordable housing. Crisis here, vacant office space. Is there a way to put these two things together and solve two problems at the same time? And I argue in the paper, yes, this is a tremendous opportunity. Converting this space to housing is much cheaper and much faster than new construction. So, and office space in general, the infrastructure of a building built for commercial use is much better than a single family or, any residential structure. Better heating, better air conditioning, better security, stronger construction, intercoms. There are all sorts of things that would make this space better for housing than buildings built for housing per se. So this is a tremendous opportunity in my view. It could happen quickly. It meets a lot of needs for people. It would create new neighborhoods in the city. And by the way, it's not just limited to office space. There are other vacant spaces that you see. If you walk around any big city post-COVID, you see vacant storefronts all over the place. You see hotels, many hotels that have become homeless shelters because there's no one staying there. All these facilities are potentially housing. They're potentially government office space. There's productive reuse for these spaces. And those people would create business for small businesses, new grocery stores, new restaurants, new dry cleaners. I admit that there's a potential problem for some of the suburbs where people might decide to move back into the city. But I'm more concerned about people in the city right now who don't have affordable housing, who all of a sudden could be rehoused in more decent housing. It would dramatically increase the supply of housing at the working level and even lower levels. And in fact, government could act to subsidize it to make sure a certain proportion were available for people of very low income. So that's basically the plan. That's the idea. It's happening in the paper. I give you some examples. There's several projects in Florida where they have converted hotel space into apartments. There's a couple of conversions now going on in Charlotte, in that triangle in North Carolina. Cleveland actually, prior to COVID-19, started to convert large numbers of vacant manufacturing and commercial space to affordable housing and offices. And they've actually converted over 4 million square feet of commercial space into housing. And it's not even new to New York. If you know at all the area down by Soho, that was all manufacturing and commercial space. Now it's both housing and retail. Same thing around the High Line. That was all old manufacturing space, a lot of abandoned buildings, dangerous neighborhood. It's been converted mostly to a residential neighborhood. And by the way, with a lot of low-income housing that was already pre-existing in the area and public housing. So that's the idea. It's not intellectually that complicated, but it's a logistical challenge, right? You've got a lot of different players who need to get involved. The government needs to be involved. The government has to rezone. The private sector has to be organized. They own the buildings, or the banks literally have mortgages. So the banks are co-owners with commercial properties. There's all sorts of leases that go on between businesses, owners of the buildings, the banks who mortgage the buildings, the government who regulates zoning, community organizations. I mean, the fortunate thing is there won't be a lot of NIMBY because in most of these places, they're not residential places to begin with. So there aren't a lot of people living in these areas right now. So there's not going to be the kind of opposition to people other than market rate tenants saying, we don't want those people in our neighborhood. There isn't any people in the neighborhood. These will be new neighborhoods and they'll be mixed income from the beginning. So how do you get this started? Well, it will have to be a partnership of, I would argue, advocates and people who are specialists in low and moderate income housing. It will require the government for zoning and tax purposes. There'll have to be tax incentives. The banks will have to be involved because they own the mortgages on a lot of these properties. The private lessees will need to be involved. And who starts it? How does this get done? And that's what I talk about at the end of the paper. And that's what we talk about in social value investing. Philanthropy has a tremendous role to play here. And not so much, I would argue, yes, can they subsidize it? Can they put more money in? Ford Foundation borrowed, I think, over $1 billion against their assets so that they could fund more initiatives this year. to deal with the aftermath of COVID. So money is there, but what we need them more is for these foundations to convene meetings on this topic. For Ford Foundation to send out invitations to banks, to private builders, to major companies, to community advocates, to the government, and say, this is an idea that can work. Let's come together and make a plan. Let's start an area. Let's pick a location, and let's get going. So that's my idea. That's my food for thought. Again, I think it has tremendous potential, and particularly if it's structured as a public-private partnership. We're not asking for government to dramatically increase taxes to do this. In fact, in the property tax area, there could be some tax reductions, tax incentives for people who want to do this. It's clearly something that the market can't do by itself. It's clearly something that the government can't do by itself. Housing is an area where banks are always involved. They provide a lot of the capital, whether it's market rate or middle income housing. So food for thought. So that's my proposal. I'd love to hear from you. I mean, this is, let me say one last thing, and that is there has been some interest. I've had discussions with people in the Bay Area. We've had some discussions with the Gates Foundation, with Chan Zuckerberg. There's interest among the foundations in affordable housing. I've also had some discussions with Mayor Fulop, who's a SEPA grad in Jersey City. We've actually done a couple of studies for him about how to increase the supply of affordable housing. Jersey City, the good news is Jersey City is booming. The bad thing is prices of housing in Jersey City are skyrocketing, and there's a looming affordable housing crisis in Jersey City. So we've had some discussions there, and we have some hope that maybe Mayor Fulop and his team will embrace at least this in part. And Yumi raises a question in the chat, which is a good one, and that is this whole WeWorks idea that was booming pre-pandemic and has run into some problems. The idea of creating some of this housing as work-live space, I think, is also has huge potential. Some of the vacant office space was being bought up or leased out by WeWorks to do this. Integrating them together is also something that would require the government. We need zoning to do that, but that's government's power. They could do that very easily. And again, I think the resistance in these areas would not be tremendous because these are not primarily residential areas that are already predetermined, where people, aggressively protect what they see as their most valuable asset, and that is their housing. Let me just read this there's another one that Paul has put in the chat. He said many condos were illegally converted to Airbnb and hotels. Could this happen? Again, Paul and Yumi are right on it. That's another opportunity. I mean, we have a lot of potential housing out there that is either hotels or hotels by any other name, but they're apartments owned by LLCs who don't live there. They rent them out. They're really quasi hotels. And by the way, as a once and always member of the FDNY, FDNY hates Airbnb because they walk into buildings where there's a fire and they expect units to be having one or two people, and there are 18 people in it, or there's nobody in it. and it's locked and bolted. It's locked electronically. So I think there's tremendous opportunity, just like office buildings where there's vacancies. There are lots of Airbnb businesses, not people renting a room in their apartment, which I think is fine. And that bed and breakfast were the Airbnb forerunner, where people lived and had people sharing their space. That's viable. I think taking rental housing space and converting it into apartments is not good for the city of New York. And so maybe reconverting that space back into housing would be great.
I have a question. It's so actually I have two questions. So I guess that you are assuming that New York City is not gonna bump back into going back to normal, what we used to consider normal life, and everybody goes to the office. Because doing so, I've heard of a lot of companies releasing their employees to work from home and following that plan, but I've heard of a lot more just still hoping. So I don't know, like the assumption, I guess, would be that we're not hoping for the economy to go, for the normal life to come back. And my second question is like, what does that mean for the budget of New York City? Because New York City gets a lot of rent from these office spaces and a lot of taxes. Does that mean that these companies might move away from New York, and it means that New York City is going to get less taxes? Is that going to affect the budget of New York?
So those are two great
two
questions.
separate.
Two great questions. And no one on earth has the answer to the first one. Will people come back? Will office workers come back? Yes. Will it come back 100%? No. I'm 99% certain. I think my first appearance at Food for Thought was back in June, and I talked about the 4-day work week. I think the 4-day work week in the office is going to become more normal than abnormal, which would mean, let's assume everybody came back, but we adopted the 4-day work week. On average, that would mean 80% reoccupancy. They'd still free up 20%, which is a lot of housing. And, it actually doesn't mean less people in New York. It just means more people in New York who stay in New York. They don't come in and out every day. And I think in terms of Long Island Railroad and Jersey Transit and MTA, having 80% of what we used to have would actually be great, because then it'd be full. It won't be Sardineville. I don't think
Agree on that.
I don't think anybody really wants to go back to, having 80 gazillion people on the platform at 8:30 trying to cram into a train. And even it wasn't true then, and it's definitely not true now. There's no way the MTA is going to increase capacity over where it was before COVID by another 20%. So if we could free up 20% of mass transit, it'd still be full, and everything would be better. So it's not going to stay at 8%, and it's not going to go to 100%. So it's going to be somewhere in between. And I think, again, the 4-day work week is going to become more normal. It has lots of advantages for people in terms of childcare, in terms of CO2 pollution, in terms of traffic. I mean, there are all sorts of benefits to having less time in an office. So I think that's the answer to your first question. I don't know, but I think there's going to be I'd be surprised if it's not at least 20%. And that's a lot of new housing potentially, and fills up all those buildings, which is good. The second question is also a great question, which is, what about property taxes? And property taxes are the single biggest component of revenue for big cities around the country. It's more like 30%, but it's the single biggest component, right? So sales taxes, 25, 30, intergovernmental aid, user charges, but it's a big chunk and they can't afford to lose that. So one way they don't lose it, of course, is that some of the business is coming back, right? So, and we're not talking about any of these properties being vacated, but it is true that property taxes on residential buildings, particularly low and moderate income, will not generate as much money as commercial. So that either means, right, let's assume, but the other side is that those 20% that used to be office workers will now be living here. So they'll be spending taxes, they'll be going to restaurants, they'll be going to Broadway, they'll be paying sales tax, they'll be shopping. So some of that loss will be made up by the people, and they will be paying city income tax, which people who live in New Jersey and live on Long Island and live in Westchester don't pay New York City income tax. So it's not a wash. So there will be some loss. Some of it will be made up. Maybe there needs to be more money from the state. Maybe there needs to be higher income tax. Ultimately, the big, it's not a dirty secret. I think the truth of what this country needs to do, that I hope the Biden administration has enough guts to do it, but I'm not sure, is that wealthy people need to pay more in taxes, pure and simple. And I'm not wealthy, but I'm not poor. But I'm doing my taxes now. Give or take, I pay about 35% of my income in federal, state, and local taxes. Most people above me pay around 10, and the people at the very top pay less than 1%. So if the people above, I would say the middle to upper middle class pay somewhere between 28 and 35% of their income in taxes. If people above that paid that, we'd have way more money than we have now for government. And that is the solution. Warren Buffett every year goes to Congress and testifies, you should tax me more. But of course, he doesn't voluntarily pay more. He pays a higher percentage. His executive assistant pays a higher percentage of her income in taxes than he does. And he's like the fifth richest person in the world. And while he pays his executive assistant well, he doesn't pay her that well. Maybe she makes 175,000, maybe. So we're not asking, this is not a rob the rich solution. It's really a fairness solution. It's not fair the way it is. It's really not fair. And so that's the solution to the tax problem. And so far, unfortunately, none of our politicians on the right or the left have really embraced that. Few, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, some people who are considered quote unquote socialists, they have. But, you haven't really heard the Bidens or Kamala or Andrew Cuomo for that matter. You haven't heard those people talk about raising income tax.
No, because they don't want to lose next term, because for them it's just losing political power.
Yeah, but I don't even think that's right placed, right?
I know, I completely agree. I
In
completely
fact, rich people, a lot of rich people continue to live in the United States because that's where the opportunity is and that's where it's safest. They could move to other places that pay less taxes, but they don't. They want to live here. Bill Gates never moved from Seattle. So, you know, if we raise their taxes, would they applaud? No. Would they move? No. Would they pay them? Yes. And who are they going to give the money to, right? I mean, in the end, it's a small price to pay. And by the way, if you're Jeff Bezos and your net worth is $175 billion, I mean, come on. Come on. We're talking about, the extra $5 that falls out of my pocket. And would I wish I have that $5 back? Yes. Will it affect what I have for dinner? No. Would him paying the same percentage of income tax that I pay affect his income? Yes. Would he be able to tell me how much it is? No. He doesn't even know how much. He doesn't do his own taxes. He doesn't even know how much taxes he pays. So,
hey, Professor Emick.
Yes.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Chris?
Good, thanks. Sorry, my internet's not very good today, but my question is about the feasibility of converting Midtown versus converting other commercial spaces around the city that aren't as dense and potentially have more like wraparound services such as parks, green space, grocery stores, access to schools, things that Midtown doesn't have. I know when I did my project for you last semester on this exact topic, we talked about the Property Pathways program, which the city had started before the pandemic, which is intended to help small commercial owners convert their property. Do you know anything about that, and have you heard anything about that? Because it kind of disappeared when the pandemic happened. And I also think it's a great stress test and viability test for these kind of larger programs in Midtown that you're talking about to start in other places.
Yes, and absolutely, it works everywhere. It works everywhere, and it will be the problem. The problem as a person who's been in and around, government for 30 years is, I think for it to really catch on, we've got to go to scale. Hear me, I'm not saying only Midtown, but I'm saying if we just focus on Fordham Road in the Bronx, we're not going to have enough impact, and it's going to take time, and we're not going to, we're going to see tens of units, maybe hundreds of units, but we're not going to see thousands of units. And in order for this thing to really go, we're going to have to show its potential. I think it should be everywhere in the city. And there are opportunities in the Bronx. There are opportunities. And I agree with you too. I mean, all things being equal, even if I could afford it, I wouldn't live in Soho because there aren't any parks. And there's, it's intense. It's not terrible. I mean, if somebody gave me an apartment there, I'd definitely take it. But I'd rather live as I do here on 119th Street. I have a park like right outside my door in Morningside Park, and I have Riverside Park a couple of blocks away. And I have the quad of the university. So there are a lot of neighborhoods around the city that have the same issues, right? This issue is in a lot of places. The pandemic made it worse, but the Amazon phenomena and the idea of buying things online and having things delivered rather than shopping, that's probably, again, like the office space, it's going to come back, but it's not going to come back the way it was. So there's going to be a residual of retail space. There's going to be a residual of office space and small business space. And, we need to be creative. I mean, originally, Soho started to change when we allowed artists who had come to occupy those old factories as art and living spaces. That kicked off. We had, back in the 70s, we had tax programs and zoning issues that was called artist housing. So they allowed artists to convert factory space into housing. And at that time, that space wasn't worth much. You know, now those apartments are selling for $20 million. So we could recreate that in terms of, like Yumi was suggesting, entrepreneur space, you know, work, living spaces, small business and living spaces. Maybe one of the ways to save small retail business is to actually start to re-engineer those spaces that people could live there. You know, have the store, just like the old days, have the store in the front and the apartment in the back, or the apartment upstairs. I mean, that's not crazy. I mean, again, maybe it's not for everybody, but for some people, it would be great. Some people would love that. I mean, the great thing about having a big city is, you know, what I hate, you love, and vice versa. So I think this is I tried to keep it simple for now, which is, let's take vacant office space and make it housing. But I think what you guys are suggesting is exactly right. There are multiple ways to deal with the post-COVID world that could help people, that could help small business, that could help homeowners, that could help banks and real estate people rethink the city. And in rethinking the city, I think we should also throw in what I had to say 8 or 9 months ago. And that is, you know, as I said then, the last major reform of the work week was Henry Ford, who was not a humanist by any stretch. In the 1920s and 30s, where Ford Motor Company went from a 6-day work week to a 5-day work week. That was the last major shift in work weeks, almost 100 years ago. Isn't it time to rethink? Now, Henry Ford did it because he thought, well, if my workers had 2 days off, maybe they'll buy a car. That was his idea. Give people more leisure, they'll spend more money, they'll buy a car. I think these days, yes, one, it will create more retail, but there'll also be families that'll be together more. There'll be less CO2 emissions. There'll be a more balanced life for people, where the stresses of urban life, there's been stresses with COVID, but there have also been pluses. People exercising more, people pursuing creative arts, people spending more time with their kids, people getting pets, people communicating with friends more. There's no reason why, because of technology, we not only have more conveniences, we are more efficient using our time. And actually, if you want to think this through, because I worked at the fire department, which is open 24 hours a day, 365 days, it's never closed. The fire department never closes. There's no reason for any business, actually, anymore, to close. It can always be open. People don't have to work all the time. Firemen work one day, 24 hours. They have a day off. Then they work another day, 24 hours. And then they're off for 6 days. Now, you don't have to get that crazy. But having everybody work 4 days or even 3 days in the office, you could hire more people. You could be more productive. Businesses and government could provide better services. It could be better for everybody. We have not, pre-COVID, really thought about how could we better use our time to be better for everybody. We just don't do it. You know, we are, for good or for bad, and our corporations reflect us. We're creatures of habit. Once we start doing it one way, we just keep doing it. Get up and, I mean, I've been struck for this because and we're out of time, so I got to go, but I'll leave you with this one. I, pre-COVID, traveled all around the world, once a month at least, often twice. And one of the things I was always struck with, no matter where I worked, is starting at 8 o'clock, traffic builds, and then it dissipates. And then starting at 4 o'clock, traffic builds, and then it dissipates. Except 8 and 5 are totally different times. They're the middle of the night somewhere else. Yet everywhere in the world, people go to work and come home the same time. It's nuts. It's just nuts. It's nuts. And it's not productive. It's stupid, right? So I'll leave you with that. We're habitual creatures to our benefit and to our detriment. Let's think about what's bad about our habits and how can we reprogram our habits to make life better for all of us. Jeremy, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. You guys already gave me some new good ideas.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for a great session. We hope to see everyone back here next week. We'll have Brian Kennedy, a professor in the EMPA program, for our next Food for Thought. And stay on the lookout for future Food for Thought sessions. We love having your questions and inviting speakers. And if you have any guest speakers you'd like to hear from, just let us know.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Great day.
Bye.